Greetings, YouTube. That's New England for you. 2 days ago, it was a heat wave, and now I've got a sweatshirt on. I just finished looking at Esper's Genius, I think, or Genesis. I can't remember. It's a fifth edition science fiction game. So they're taking the fifth edition rules and porting it over to science fiction setting. And I thought I'd take a look at it. I really liked how the rules for fifth edition, at least to my mind, really seemed to fit quite well into the game Gene Funk. So I thought I'd see if it was a little bit more of a traditional science fiction, travel to planets, empires, things like that. And this one was heavily influenced with the concept of Esper, psionics, which is something I've always enjoyed in my science fiction. I like having a science fiction setting that has some degree of psionics, and if even if it's very, you know, well understood and rigidly constructed, so that it's the kind of thing that uh, is infused into a society or societies. I don't have a problem with that. Um, so I thought I'd take a look at it and see how it looked, and it didn't wow me. It just it was it was there. It didn't bowl me over. For some reason, it didn't seem to click as well for me as Gene Funk did, which I felt was just that setting. Maybe it was the setting. I don't know, but that setting seemed to fit the rules really well, and this one seemed to. It just didn't seem to have traction. It didn't seem to move me in any way, shape, or form. I'm looking at it, and I find myself reading the. I read through all the species, and they were okay. I started reading through the classes, and I'm like, yeah, okay, okay. Well, this design is very similar to the class I just read. The third class is kind of very similar in design to the first two I read, and it just seemed a whole lot of sameness, which kind of bugged me. But there were a couple of things that did stick out to me um, that I have noticed over the years has popped up with other systems that have been based on some variety of D&D, whether even if you have to, push a lot of stuff out of the way to see the roots of it. For example, I'm talking about Palladiums. I don't think you can look at Palladium and not see second edition Dungeons and Dragons in there. At least I can't. Um, And the first thing I found a little bit jarring was that the game chose to use imperial measurements. Now, if you're going to give me a science fiction setting, I want it to be metric because metric seems science fiction. If you don't use metric, it seems dated. It seems like something that was written before the 1990s. It's something that wasn't willing to admit that, except for two countries on the planet, everyone else is using metric. Maybe we can accept the fact that in the future, everyone will be using metric. Um, so I find that whenever I read those units of measurement in a science fiction setting, it always kind of kicks me out of the setting slightly, and I have to kind of like push my way back in. But the other thing I notice is that it's a science fiction setting, but they're using alignments. And I realized that I don't like that. I don't want alignments in a science fiction setting. I don't want them in a cyberpunk setting. I don't want them in a transhuman setting like Gene Funk. That I don't mind them. In fact, I consider them, pretty standard operating procedure for high fantasy, but I don't like them in science fiction. It just doesn't seem to fit. Because let's be honest, how many people do we know in the real world fall neatly into one of those 9 categories when it comes to alignments in the real world? How many? How many people do you know that you could point a finger at and definitively say this person is X alignment and never, ever, ever question that? Because I got to tell you, I don't think I know anybody. At one time, I would say quite honestly that I consider myself to be neutral good. But I've had time to think about that and pharmaceuticals and therapy and facing some hard truths. about myself and the world at large. And I realize that I don't know if I'm neutral good anymore. There are times I definitely think of myself as chaotic, neutral, self-interested. I will admit that the way I interpret that is I want every human being to have human rights and civil liberties because I think that is in my best self-interest. That may not be a way of looking at the world that some people agree with. I think it's much more nuanced to admit that none of us have alignments, that in the real world they don't really seem to be applicable. They are in high fantasy because high fantasy is a completely fictitious mode, a narrative from the real world. It's got nothing to do. It's fairy tales. So having the blackest blacks and the whitest whites, and when it comes to ethical and moral thinking, seems to make perfect sense. But out in science fiction or speculative fiction, if you want something that's a little bit more grounded, alignments don't seem to really fit. So I'm curious for other folks, how often do you just kind of accept the fact that a system has got rules in it for alignments, regardless of the genre? You don't question the fact that the setting has alignments in it. S- Again, Palladium did that. They had alignments, but their alignments were much more descriptive of particular ethical and moral philosophies. They were not the same clear-cut categories as D&D style alignments. They were a lot closer to what I was describing when I was talking about self-interest, and I think that my self-interest is best served by everyone having rights. That long term is the best shot I've got of living a long, happy, healthy life, and those I care about living long, happy, healthy lives. I know that to the folks on the American right, that makes me a screaming communist. Um, but I personally think that makes me just a gold-faced realist. Um, so, so, potatoes, potatoes, I guess. Um, but when it comes to my science fiction, I don't think alignment fits. And like I said, I don't think imperial measurements fit either. Funnily enough, I'm currently reading a fantasy setting, kind of a steampunky kind of thing. And the name escapes me. I just started reading it. I've only cracked a few. I haven't even gotten past the description of what their mechanic is, which is using different die sizes to describe. So like, for example, if you have a strength of 8, you use a D8 to roll for your strength. That's what you use. And if you have a 9, you round down, so you're still going to go for a D8. But if you have a 10, you're going to use a D10. Um, the percentage splits on a system like that are different than on a D20, which is 5% per point, or a percentile, which is 1% per point, or even a 3 to 18 bell curve, or any other kind of bell curve, which is, again, a different distribution. Um, Savage World uses a very similar mechanic to that. But in the game, it would kind of crack me up because they have to stop, and they're describing the imperial system to an audience that has been raised on metric. So having to explain to people this, we think that this fits the setting much better than metric for this reason. And it's the same reasoning I've got. For them, imperial makes more sense in a fantasy setting, and for me, metric seems to make much more sense in a science fiction setting. So let's talk about what we find jarring when it comes to science fiction. And I realize that science fiction is going to be considered very soft if it's got espers in it. It's got, psionic powers. I get that. That there are folks that like their science fiction really hard. And they want you to feel every single moment of space travel that you have to go through for that reason. And that there's much softer, squishier stuff out there like, Star Trek and Star Wars. Um, and admittedly, that Star Trek is moderately harder than Star Wars, but not by much. There's a lot of woo in Star Trek. Just it's a little less blatant than the woo in Star Wars. Um, so let's talk about what we consider to be jarring when it comes to science fiction as opposed to science fantasy and when it comes to our personal preferences.